Hi, Yassine. Thanks for chatting with me today. It's you've been a great supporter of TSSA's Inclusive Rail campaign for a while now, so thank you for that. Um, Today we're thinking about lesbian visibility, and I'm a lesbian. I'm a role model for our TSSA Inclusive Rail campaign, which seeks to make the railway inclusive of LGBT plus people by 2025. And so I really want to explore the experiences of lesbians in the workplace and in the community, and bring that visibility to life. So I have a few questions for you about being lesbian. But let's start with, first of all, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Yassine, pronoun she and her ish. There's some exploration going on around that at the moment, but I am a diversity and inclusion specialist. I am the director of a company called Confronting Change, and my work focuses on creating race equity within workspaces, but also I have an expertise in LGBT inclusion, which is a lot of the work that I was doing with TSSA previously. Yeah, it's just my passion, creating inclusive workspaces and inclusive communities generally. I have a master's in gender and sexuality studies, which is sort of what's driven a lot of this work in, but I also kind of have a history in creating like LGBT inclusive community spaces and things like that as well. And so, yeah, it's just my passion, both personally and professionally.
Fantastic. Wow, that's a lot you do. So great, you're a great activist and advocate for the community. So look, first of all, how do you identify, and why is that important to you?
So I would identify as lesbian or queer. Masculine of center is a term that I've heard recently that I actually quite like, and I think is quite appropriate for me. And I'd say I was a gender non-conforming woman. And a cisgender woman as well. And yeah, all those terms are quite important to me. I think the term lesbian because firstly, it's not only defines who I'm attracted to, but I think there's a lot of history and weight that is attached to that term as well. And I know that sometimes people shy away from using the term lesbian and would prefer to refer to themselves as gay women or just as queer. And for me, queer is also equally important as a term because it's about kind of opening up the exploration around my sexuality, but also around my gender as well. And I feel like with labels, sometimes it can feel like they're, about putting you in a box. But actually, I feel that particularly the term queer is about giving me freedom of exploration, and rather than kind of tucking me away into something. And then within the term lesbian, I think there's a lot of like strength and like links to history and a history of fighting back against establishments and social movements and things like that. And so there's a lot of power in the term. And then, yeah, like around gender non-conforming and masculine of center, or sometimes people refer to me as Butch as well. And I think that's just like, I mean, there's, yeah, a lot of, we can explore that as we talk a bit further, but there's a lot of like history for me personally in my relationship to those identities and how I feel about them and how I feel that they reflect like how I present to the world.
Wow, yeah, I think the reason I asked that question is it's so personal to people, and I think that people who might be allies or supporters or just want to learn a little bit more, it's really important to share what we can as role models to for people to understand what identity means to us, and why it's important. How we choose to identify ourselves is quite important. So let's talk about that. The butch and masculine of center and non-gender conforming. Let's talk about that all a little bit more. So what does that mean for you?
So the term butch, particularly for me, is one that I find so interesting because a lot of people refer to me as butch, and it's not something that I necessarily would have called myself until fairly recently, where I've kind of felt like I've stepped into it a lot more, and I kind of worked through some of the issues around it that I have had previously that were attached to maybe even like a bit of shame, and a bit of kind of this sense of always feeling like you're, not the right kind of woman because you're, I guess a bit more masculine or a bit more, not as traditionally feminine. And so, yeah, it's been something that I've been definitely on a journey with throughout my life. I think, I've always been like a little tomboy. And at that point, it was kind of fine. I didn't really have questions about my sexuality. So it was just how like older people kind of saying there's something wrong with being this way, with being a little bit, playing with boys and being, a bit rougher and stuff. And then obviously as you grow up, that, there are other things that get attached to that around, like even my sexuality and things. So yeah, it's definitely been a bit of a journey, but now like it's something that again, I'm finding quite a lot of power in, and a lot of I feel like I'm claiming the term, and it's not just other people putting it on me. It's me actually saying, yeah, I'm happy to be seen and to be defined as butch or masculine of center. And it's nothing really to do with like male ideas around like traditional gender ideas around maleness. It's nothing to do with that really, because I think there's a lot of, toxicity around a lot of those ideas that aren't good for anybody, whether they are, identify as male or not. But I think those ideas definitely had a hold on me for a long time growing up, where I kind of felt like, okay, if I'm going to be like butch, or if this is who I am, then I also have to be stoic, and I have to be like, not expressing emotion at any point. And, I can't get sad about things, and I've got to be dominant all the time, and all these like, kind of unhealthy ideas that I think are generally attached to masculinity. And yeah, so it's been more of a bit of a kind of, now I'm embracing it more in the sense of what it means to me as a woman and in relation to my womanhood. And, it's kind of become a lot softer, not only in necessarily in how I present or anything, but more in terms of how I treat myself, and how I'm kind of a bit more, like I allow a bit more space to be gentle with myself, to say like, actually, it is okay to feel emotion. It is okay to cry if you're upset. You are allowed to ask for things in, relationship or in friendships. And yeah, so it's kind of been a really interesting journey. And also like, I was just thinking about being younger and like where this all started. And it was because actually I didn't see a lot of like women who looked like me, and butch women, on TV or media or anything growing up. Any kind of links I had to like the LGBT community or the spectrum presented in those mediums was generally of flamboyant, camp, gay men. And I think it's quite interesting because that's probably had the biggest influence of me and how I've like interpreted my sexuality, because I think I'm a bit of a dandy. I'm a bit of like, I'm wearing like all pink today and stuff. And I think, that sense of feeling really like viewing masculinity through that lens, where it's actually about joy and a freedom of expression and exploration, but just being really authentic to who they were. And, in kind of in societies that, were not very necessarily accepting of them. And so those were my biggest influences actually, in like exploring my butch identity.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. And I think I read a blog post that you'd written also about being a Black African woman and what that means as a lesbian. So how does that intersect with being with being lesbian for you and your general identity and who you are?
I think for a very long time, it felt like the two, like there was no connection, that if I was going to be one thing, I couldn't be the other. And so I actually grew up in Senegal, in West Africa until I was 12. And then I came to the UK, and I was in an environment where it was actually, I was in an all-girls school, and that's where I kind of first started like coming out and exploring my sexuality and stuff. And because there was maybe this like automatic like disconnect from my culture, and I at the same time was going through all these like feelings about who I was and my sexuality and stuff, and at that point it was almost like a cutoff for me of saying, okay, I'm here now and I'm queer and I'm, kind of embracing that side of things. So I have to shut down this other side of things, which is like my Blackness and definitely my relationship to like my African heritage. And I think over time, and especially in the last year, definitely with all the conversations that have been happening, kind of about race and things like that. But even before that, there's been this quite big journey of exploration for me to kind of unite all the aspects of my identity and the most important elements, which for me are probably my race and my sexuality. So yeah, it's been quite like a deep exploration and a deep like unpacking and unlearning of all these ideas that were imposed upon me, especially from an African perspective about like it being un-African or it be, not being I was raised, in a very Christian environment. So like, it going against our religion. And actually, so for me, I've been doing this exploration of like religions and cultures from pre-colonial periods, from before, we were told that these things weren't African or didn't belong to us, where, there were communities that very much embraced gender nonconformity, that had, whole like social classes and revered people as priests and priestesses. And, there were cultures where women married women, and it was, and there weren't these like patriarchal cultures all the time. So these are all things that I'm discovering now, and I'm learning and kind of finding my place in and finding a way to meld the two together. And I think, again, going back to the use of the term queer, like that's particularly useful for me in these explorations because it kind of says something very different from, I guess, Western understandings of like what LGBTQ and what that community means, which is also still very important to me. But I think with queer, there's just a bit more room for me to explore how that relates to my African heritage and things like, like ancestral linkages and things like that, and traditional religions and tribal religions and languages and things like that, as well as it being about just who I'm attracted to. It becomes this much bigger thing. And like, I guess while I'm here, I've always like the LGBT community and the groups that I've kind of been part of, my friendship groups and stuff, have just ended up being predominantly white because of where I've lived, or, just like the thing, just that's how it's worked out. And it's not to say that those people were repressing me in any way. I think if anything, I was just repressing myself, or never felt like I was able to be fully African and fully like vocal and open about that side of myself. And so it's, again, been a bit of an exploration recently where I've kind of have found more POC LGBTQ communities, and where I found other like African people, African and queer people, and that's made a huge impact to like how I reconcile those things now, definitely.
Well, just hearing you speak is kind of thinking about my own journey and my own experiences too. I think there's different layers to identity, isn't there? At first, it helps you just kind of find your place in the world by finding an identity. But as I've grown older and more experienced in life, it's actually been a way to help me explore who I am and understand who I am, which I'm hearing that's been part of your journey too. Exploring your identity has really helped you understand who you are. And look, one thing that's very interesting to us, which we'll explore a bit more in many different ways, but I'd like to ask you about, is do you feel there's any privilege that you have as being lesbian?
This is such an interesting question to me. Because I think, like, in the grand scheme of like society and societal hierarchies, not really, especially as like a Black lesbian and Butch, and like plus a big girl. I'm like, so on many ways I'm kind of marginalized in different things, and then like from an intersectional point, I'm at all these intersections of marginalization. It's very rare that I feel like I have any kind of privilege or power. but at the same time, I am also always kind of thinking about that and considering it. And I think more so than like, yeah, it's interesting. I think more so like it's like I think even in situations where people are kind of interested in you or welcoming you, it's coming from a place of othering still. It's coming from a place where you're almost like a novelty. And sometimes it feels like, is this the best we can get? Like, I sometimes have like straight guys will, want to be like, okay, how do we interact with you? We just want to treat you like one of the guys. So we'll come over here and we'll talk about women in a really derogatory way because this is how we.
Yeah. Yeah, I've experienced that too.
Yeah, and it's like, I do appreciate the effort. However, I think we've really misread how that's going to go down. And I think it's interesting because sometimes, like, I just being in the spaces, I am able to have conversations with people where it's like, actually, regardless of whether I'm here or not, you shouldn't be having this conversation for X, Y, and Z reasons. So there's kind of maybe a little bit of like, I'm able to infiltrate things in a weird way that maybe like other women wouldn't, which is quite interesting to me. And then I also think like, just, if we're talking about, so in the work that I do with D&I, a lot of the times we're talking about like creating new ways of working, new systems of operation, and trying to envision a world where, things are just a bit more equal and a bit more equitable, and we're understanding other people's experiences and how it's brought us to the place we're at. And I think being somebody who's, in theory, on the fringes and on the margins of a lot of these spaces, you kind of have to gain the sense of understanding and empathy of other people because, like, for so long you are, that's all you've got to kind of get you through. And I'm thinking about so many movements that have been started by the people on the edges, by queer people, by queer Black people, queer Black women, poor people, the people who are most disenfranchised and most marginalized. And it's this sense of actually like, I've got nothing to lose, but I still believe that like things can be better, not only for me, but for everybody. And that sense of kind of trying to push things into this new way of working, this new way of existing, and these new societies. So in a weird way, I think that's maybe a bit of a privilege where we're kind of at the forefront of something different, whatever that, it's hard to envision what that looks like sometimes, but yeah, like we're leading the charge towards that and like away from, this idea where there's a finite amount and everybody's scrapping for bits of, a tiny bit of nothing.
Yeah, I think that's it's a question that when we talk about privilege, we have to investigate our own privilege. So it's one that I definitely want to be exploring as part of this series of exploring the experiences of lesbian women, in particular from a TSSA perspective. It's the railway is still a very male-dominated industry. And, is there any privilege that a lesbian might have, and maybe a lesbian butch lesbian or more masculine of center person would experience being in such an industry? So it's a question that we're going to be reflecting on a lot. So thank you so much for sharing with all that personal stuff with us today. And I look forward to having further conversations with you and with others on this journey. So thanks very much, Yassine.
Thank you for having me.